Argonne Forest, France, October 8th, 1918, 06:15 hours, and Corporal Alvin York, a lean, red-haired mountain man from the hills of Tennessee, crouches in the cold morning mist watching German machine gun fire tear through the American lines like a scythe through wheat. Around him, men from Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division are falling, their bodies crumpling into the mud as the distinctive rattling bark of German MG-08 machine guns echoes through the forest. York's patrol, 17 men strong just minutes ago, has already lost half its number to the withering fire pouring from the ridge ahead. What the Germans holding those machine gun positions cannot possibly know, what no soldier in the Imperial German Army could imagine in their most confident moments, is that the quiet corporal leading this American patrol spent his entire youth hunting wild game in the mountains of Tennessee, developing marksmanship skills so refined that he could shoot the head off a running turkey at 50 yards. And within the next hour, this reluctant warrior who tried to avoid military service on religious grounds will single-handedly kill at least 25 German soldiers and capture 132 more in an action so extraordinary that even his own commanders will initially struggle to believe it happened. The story of how Alvin York came to be crouching in that French forest, rifle in hand, ready to unleash carnage on the German army, begins not with patriotic fervour or military ambition, but with a profound internal struggle between faith and duty that nearly kept him out of the war entirely. Born on December 13, 1887, in a two-room log cabin in Pall Mall, Tennessee, near the Kentucky border, York grew up in the isolated Wolf River Valley, where life revolved around subsistence farming, hunting, and the harsh realities of mountain poverty. The third of 11 children, York learned to shoot as soon as he was old enough to hold a rifle because meat on the family table depended entirely on his accuracy with a gun. His father, a blacksmith and farmer, taught him to make every shot count because ammunition cost money the family could barely afford. York became legendary in Fentress County for his shooting ability, regularly winning turkey shoots where competitors would pay an entry fee for a chance to shoot at targets, with the winner taking home a live turkey. York won so consistently that organisers sometimes banned him from competitions to give others a chance. But the young Alvin York was far from the clean-cut hero he would later become. Before 1914, York lived what he would later describe as a wild and sinful life, spending his nights drinking corn whiskey in the rough saloons and honky-tonks scattered through the Tennessee hills, gambling away his meagre wages, and engaging in the kind of hell-raising common among young mountain men with too much energy and too few opportunities. His mother, Mary Elizabeth York, a deeply religious woman, prayed constantly for her wayward son, watching him stumble home drunk, knowing that the combination of alcohol, pride, and quick tempers in those mountain community often ended in violence. The turning point came in 1914 when York's close friend Everett Delk was killed in a barroom brawl, a senseless death that shook York to his core and forced him to confront the destructive path his life had taken. Shortly after, York attended a revival meeting at the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a small fundamentalist denomination that preached strict adherence to biblical teachings, including absolute pacifism and the belief that Christians should not take human life under any circumstances. York experienced what he described as a profound religious conversion, turning away from drinking, gambling, and violence to embrace a faith that would define the rest of his life. The Church of Christ in Christian Union took its pacifism seriously, teaching that the commandment "thou shalt not kill" applied in all circumstances, including war, and that Christians must be willing to suffer persecution and death rather than take up arms against their fellow man. York immersed himself in this teaching, reading his Bible daily, attending church services multiple times weekly, and genuinely believing that God commanded him to live peacefully regardless of what the world demanded. He became a Sunday school teacher and church elder, respected in his community for the dramatic transformation from hellraiser to faithful believer, never imagining that his commitment to non-violence would soon be tested by forces far beyond the Tennessee mountains. The test came in June 1917, when York received his draft notice, requiring him to register for military service under the Selective Service Act that President Woodrow Wilson signed into law on May the 18th. York stared at that notice, feeling the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on him. His church taught that Christians must not kill, but his country demanded that he take up arms. His pastor and fellow church members urged him to seek exemption as a conscientious objector, and York dutifully filled out his draft registration card, writing in the space asking if he claimed exemption on the religious grounds, "Yes, I don't want to fight." But the local draft board in Fentress County, Tennessee, had little sympathy for religious objections, particularly from denominations they considered obscure. The Church of Christ in Christian Union was not among the recognized peace churches like Quakers, Mennonites, or Brethren whose members received automatic conscientious objector status. The draft board denied York's request, classifying him 1A, available for immediate military service. York could have refused to report, accepting imprisonment as many conscientious objectors did, or he could have fled to avoid service. But York's religious faith, while commanding him not to kill, also taught him to render unto Caesar what was Caesar's, to obey governmental authority, and to accept suffering as part of the Christian path. Torn between these competing demands, York reported to Camp Gordon, Georgia, on November 14, 1917, to begin his training with the 82nd Infantry Division. The 82nd Division, nicknamed the All-American Division because it drew soldiers from every state in the Union, was one of the National Army divisions created specifically for World War I, composed primarily of draftees rather than regular Army soldiers or National Guard units. York found himself assigned to Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Captain Edward Danforth, beginning a basic training that would transform him from reluctant draftee into combat soldier. But York's internal struggle continued throughout those first weeks. He drilled with the rifle, learned to march and salute, followed orders mechanically, but his heart remained conflicted. He wrote letters home describing his anguish, telling his mother he didn't know what to do, didn't know if he was right to be there. York's company commander, Captain Danforth, noticed the tall, quiet soldier who performed every task competently but seemed spiritually absent, and when York requested to speak with him about his religious beliefs, Danforth listened carefully before referring York to his battalion commander, Major George Edward Buxton, Jr. What happened next would prove crucial to York's transformation from conflicted conscript to committed soldier. Buxton gave York a 10-day leave to go home to Tennessee and think about these questions, to pray about them, to search his conscience away from the pressures of military life. York returned to Pall Mall, spent days walking through the mountains he loved, reading his Bible, praying, discussing the matter with his pastor and family. The specific moment of York's decision has become part of American legend. According to his own account, York climbed to the top of a mountain overlooking the Wolf River Valley, watching the sun set over the Tennessee hills while he wrestled with the competing demands of faith and duty. Somewhere during that long night of prayer and contemplation, York came to believe that while individual violence and murder were wrong, fighting to protect freedom and stop German aggression was not only permissible but might be his Christian duty. Whether this represented a genuine theological evolution or simply the rationalization of a man who felt he had no choice is something York himself may never have fully resolved. But when he returned to Camp Gordon, he told Major Buxton he was ready to fight, that he believed God would forgive him for killing in defense of liberty and justice, that he would do his duty as a soldier while still maintaining his faith as a Christian. The 82nd Division completed its training during the brutal winter of 1917 to 1918, enduring the mud and cold of Georgia while British and French instructors, veterans of the Western Front, taught them the grim realities of trench warfare. They learned to recognize the different sounds of artillery shells, to move through barbed wire obstacles, to deal with poison gas attacks, to advance under machine gun fire. York proved to be an exceptional soldier once his religious doubts were resolved. His natural marksmanship, developed through years of hunting, made him the best shot in his company. His mountain upbringing had given him strength, endurance, and the ability to move quietly through difficult terrain. His religious discipline translated into military discipline as he followed orders precisely, maintained his equipment meticulously, and never complained about the hardships of training. By the time the 82nd Division shipped out to France in April 1918, York had been promoted to corporal, leading a small squad of men who respected his competence even if they found his teetotaling and Bible reading somewhat peculiar. The division arrived in France to find a desperate situation. The German spring offensive, launched in March, had achieved stunning initial success, breaking through British lines and threatening to capture Paris. American divisions were being rushed to the front to plug gaps in the Allied defences, thrown into combat with less training and preparation than anyone wanted. The 82nd Division initially served in a quiet sector near Marbache, conducting patrols and raids to give the men experience under fire before facing major combat. York participated in these operations, learning the difference between training and actual combat, feeling bullets crack past his head, seeing men killed by artillery fire, discovering that his religious convictions and his ability to fight could somehow coexist in the chaos of war. The division's real test came in September 1918, when the 82nd received orders to participate in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest operation ever undertaken by the American Expeditionary Forces, and one of the final campaigns of World War I. General John J. Pershing, commanding the AEF, planned to drive north through the Argonne Forest and the heights along the Meuse River, cutting the critical German railroad that supplied their forces across the Western Front. If successful, the offensive would cripple the German army's ability to maneuver and supply its troops, potentially ending the war. But the terrain favoured defence. The Argonne Forest was a 20-mile-wide tangle of ravines, ridges, and thick woods, crisscrossed with German trenches, machine gun positions, and artillery emplacements built over 4 years of war. The Germans had turned the forest into a fortress, with interlocking fields of fire, concrete bunkers, and carefully positioned observation posts that could call down artillery on any American advance. The 82nd Division entered the line on October 6, 1918, relieving exhausted units that had been attacking through the Argonne for over a week. The division's mission was to advance north, capture the Dickerville narrow-gauge railway that the Germans used to move supplies, and push through to the Aire River Valley beyond. The 328th Infantry Regiment drew the assignment to attack the high ground near the village of Châtel-Chehery, where German machine gun positions dominated the surrounding terrain. Company G, York's unit, would be in the assault, attacking at dawn on October 8th. The night before the attack, York and his squad mates huddled in a muddy trench, listening to the distinctive sounds of the Western Front. German artillery fire rumbled in the distance. Star shells periodically burst overhead, illuminating the torn landscape in flickering light. Machine gun fire rattled somewhere to their left, where another American unit was making a night patrol. The men tried to sleep, knowing they would need their strength for the attack. But true rest was impossible. Some wrote letters home, others checked their equipment repeatedly, a few whispered prayers. York sat quietly, reading his pocket Bible by candlelight, asking God to forgive him for what he was about to do, praying that he would have the courage to do his duty, hoping that he would survive to return to Tennessee and the life he had left behind. The attack began at 0610 hours on October 8th with a brief artillery barrage that did little to suppress the German defences. American shells burst along the German positions, throwing up fountains of earth and splintered trees. But the Germans had constructed their machine gun nest too well, with overhead cover and thick earthworks that protected the crews from everything except direct hits. As soon as the barrage lifted, Company G and the other units of the 328th Infantry climbed out of their trenches and began advancing through the forest. They immediately encountered devastating machine gun fire from positions the Americans hadn't even detected. The Germans, veterans of 4 years of war, had positioned their machine guns with interlocking fields of fire, creating kill zones where multiple guns could concentrate their fire on advancing troops. The distinctive sound of the German MG-08 machine gun, firing at 400 to 500 rounds per minute, echoed through the forest as American soldiers fell in clusters, cut down before they had advanced 50 yards. The attack stalled almost immediately as American troops sought whatever cover they could find in, pressing themselves into shell craters and behind fallen trees, while German machine gun fire ripped through the forest. Company G's commander tried to organise flanking movements, sending squads to the left and right to get around the German positions, but the machine gun fire was too intense, too well coordinated. Men who exposed themselves for even seconds were hit, and the advance ground to a halt with casualties mounting and no clear way forward. The situation was exactly the kind of deadly stalemate that characterised so much of World War I, where machine guns gave defenders an almost insurmountable advantage over attacking infantry. Sergeant Bernard Early, leading a platoon of Company G, realised that the frontal attack was impossible, and that the only chance was to somehow get behind the German positions. He assembled a patrol of 17 men, including Corporal York, with orders to infiltrate through the forest on the left flank, locate the German machine gun positions, and if possible, silence them from the rear. It was a desperate mission with a low probability of success, the kind of task that gets men killed without accomplishing anything. But Early was a veteran sergeant who understood that desperate situations required desperate measures, and he had confidence in the men he selected, particularly York, whose marksmanship and woodscraft might prove crucial in the kind of close-quarters combat that lay ahead. The patrol moved out, working their way through the forest parallel to the American front line, staying low, moving from cover to cover, trying to avoid detection by the German observers who could call down artillery on them. They covered perhaps 400 yards when they spotted a group of German soldiers, apparently a headquarters element or reserve unit, in a shallow ravine below them. The Germans were not in fighting positions, seemed to be taking a break, their rifles stacked, some eating, others are talking. Early made a quick decision to attack, hoping to capture the group and force them to reveal the locations of the machine gun positions. The Americans rushed down into the ravine, shouting for the Germans to surrender, and to their surprise, the Germans complied immediately, raising their hands, calling out "Kamerad," apparently having no desire to die for positions that were about to be overrun anyway. The Americans had captured about 30 German soldiers, including a major, a significant success for the patrol. But as Early was organising his prisoners, trying to decide whether to march them back to American lines or continue the mission, the situation turned catastrophic. German machine gunners on the ridge above the ravine, alerted by the noise of the capture, swung their weapons down toward the Americans and opened fire. The range was point blank, perhaps 30 yards, and the Germans couldn't miss. The machine gun fire tore into the Americans with terrible effect. 9 men, including Sergeant Early, went down in the first burst, killed or severely wounded. The patrol's other corporals were hit. Suddenly, out of 17 men, only 8 remained standing, and of those 8, York found himself the senior-ranking soldier, the man in charge of an impossible situation. York would later describe those next seconds as the most important of his life, the moment when everything he had learned in the Tennessee mountains, everything he had struggled with about faith and duty, everything he had trained for as a soldier, came together in crystal clarity about what he had to do. The German machine gunners were traversing their weapons back toward the captured Germans and remaining Americans, preparing to fire again. The captured Germans were dropping to the ground, trying to avoid being hit by their own side's fire. The surviving Americans were seeking cover, paralysed by the sudden carnage, and York, operating on instinct and training, dropped to a prone position and began shooting back with his M1917 Enfield rifle. What happened next has been described as the most effective display of rifle marksmanship in American military history. York began engaging the German machine gun positions with methodical precision, using every skill he had developed as a hunter in Tennessee. He had learned to shoot turkeys by hitting them in the head because a body shot would destroy the meat. He had learned to judge distances precisely because a miss meant no food for his family. He had learned to control his breathing, to squeeze the trigger smoothly, to account for wind and elevation, to shoot quickly but accurately. Most importantly, he had learned to stay calm under pressure, to focus completely on the target, to shut out everything else. While machine gun fire kicked up dirt around him, while his wounded comrades screamed, while German soldiers shouted and moved and returned fire, York calmly shot German machine gunners one after another. The Germans in the machine gun nests found themselves in a nightmare situation. They could see the American soldier firing at them, but they couldn't depress their weapons low enough to hit him, because machine guns in fixed positions have limited traverse and elevation. When they tried to leave their positions to engage York with rifles, he shot them before they could aim. York would later explain that he used the same technique he used for shooting turkeys. When a flock of turkeys on the ground detects danger, they start flying away from back to front. If you shoot the front bird first, the others see it fall and fly away faster. But if you shoot the back bird first, the others don't notice immediately, giving you time to shoot them all. York applied this principle to the Germans, shooting those farthest from him first, working his way forward, so that the Germans close to him didn't realise what was happening until it was too late. The engagement lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though York would later say it felt like hours. He fired somewhere between 20 and 40 rounds, the exact number lost in the chaos and adrenaline of combat. But what is certain is that German machine gun fire from the positions on the ridge stopped, that German soldiers began calling out for surrender, that York had single-handedly silenced multiple machine gun positions that had been holding up the entire American advance. But York's action wasn't finished because in the midst of the firefight, a German lieutenant named Paul Vollmer, commander of the machine gun company, recognized that his positions were being destroyed by a single American rifleman and decided on a desperate counterattack. Vollmer gathered 6 men, fixed bayonets, and charged down the slope toward York, hoping to kill him in close combat before he could reload or react. York saw them coming, 6 German soldiers running at him with fixed bayonets, perhaps 40 yards away and closing fast. He had no time to reload his rifle, which was empty after engaging the machine gun positions. Instead, York dropped his rifle, drew his 1911 Colt automatic pistol, and began shooting the charging Germans. Here again, York's hunting skills proved decisive. He shot the last man in the charge first, then worked his way forward, shooting each German, so that those in front didn't see their comrades falling behind them. One after another the Germans fell, until all 6 lay dead or wounded, and the charge collapsed just yards from York's position. Lieutenant Vollmer, watching his men cut down, realised the attack had failed, and that he was facing a marksman unlike any he had encountered in 4 years of war. York kept his pistol aimed at Vollmer, and shouted for him to surrender, to order his men to give up. Vollmer, speaking some English, shouted back, asking how many Americans were in the ravine. York, thinking quickly, called out that he had plenty and that the Germans were surrounded, which wasn't true but sounded plausible given how effectively York had been engaging multiple positions. Vollmer, his machine gun position silenced, his counterattack destroyed, and believing he faced a larger American force, agreed to surrender. He blew his whistle, the signal for his men to cease fire and surrender, and German soldiers began emerging from their positions with hands raised. York and the 7 other surviving Americans from the original patrol suddenly found themselves in charge of not 30 prisoners but more than 90 Germans emerging from machine gun positions, command posts and reserve positions throughout the area. York ordered Vollmer to command his men to form a column, and the Germans complied, their discipline holding even in surrender. But York now faced a new problem. He had more than 90 German prisoners and only 7 effective American soldiers to guard them. He was deep in German-held territory, separated from American lines by perhaps 400 yards of contested forest. German artillery was still falling, German infantry positions still lay between him and safety, and he was responsible for getting his men, his prisoners, and the wounded survivors of the initial ambush back to American lines alive. York organised the prisoners into a column, placed Vollmer at the front with York's pistol pressed against his back, and told the German officer that if any of his men tried to escape or if German forces attacked the column, York would shoot Vollmer first. It was a brutal piece of pragmatism, using Vollmer as a human shield and insurance policy, but York understood that he needed every advantage he could get to make it back alive. The column began moving back toward American lines, following a route parallel to the German trenches, As they moved, they encountered additional German positions, and in each case, York followed the same procedure. He would order Vollmer to call out to the German soldiers, ordering them to surrender, explaining that American forces had broken through and that resistance was useless. Remarkably, it worked. German soldiers, seeing their own officer under American control, seeing the long column of prisoners, believing that the American breakthrough was more extensive than it actually was, surrendered without resistance. At one machine gun position, 6 Germans manning a gun that could have slaughtered the entire column instead laid down their weapons and joined the prisoner column. At another position, a German officer tried to organize resistance, but Vollmer called out that the situation was hopeless, and the officer reluctantly ordered his men to surrender. York's prisoner count kept growing, 40 Germans, then 60, then 80, then 100. The column became increasingly unwieldy, a long string of German soldiers with a handful of Americans at the front and rear, moving through a war zone where any German unit that realized what was actually happening could have destroyed them. But York maintained absolute control through a combination of intimidation, quick thinking, and the psychological effect of the growing prisoner column itself. Each German position that surrendered made the next position more likely to surrender, because the sight of so many of their comrades under American control seemed to confirm that they were witnessing a major American breakthrough. The column finally reached American lines around 10:30 hours, and the reaction of the American soldiers was initially disbelief. A lieutenant watched York approach leading what appeared to be an entire German company and shouted, asking how many prisoners York had. York, who hadn't had time to count them precisely, shouted back that he had a tolerable few. The actual count, conducted once the prisoners were secured behind American lines, came to 132 German soldiers, including 4 officers. Additionally, York's patrol had captured 35 machine guns that were no longer firing on American forces, had killed at least 25 German soldiers, and had enabled the 328th Infantry Regiment to renew its advance and capture its objectives for the day. But the cost had been severe. Of the 17 men in the original patrol, 9 had been killed or severely wounded in the initial machine gun ambush. The survivors, exhausted, covered in mud and blood, could barely process what they had accomplished. York himself seemed almost stunned, sitting down heavily once he reached safety, his rifle and pistol finally lowered, the adrenaline that had carried him through the action draining away to leave shaking hands and overwhelming fatigue. Medics rushed to treat the wounded from the patrol while military police organized the German prisoners, marching them back to cages in the rear. Officers questioned York, trying to understand exactly what had happened, how one American soldier had captured so many Germans. York's company commander, Captain Danforth, initially thought the reports were exaggerated, that in the confusion of combat someone had inflated the numbers or misunderstood what happened. But when he questioned the survivors and interrogated the German prisoners, the story checked out. The Germans confirmed that a single American rifleman had destroyed their machine gun positions, that their lieutenant had surrendered after a failed bayonet charge, that the American corporal had methodically shot down anyone who tried to resist. Lieutenant Vollmer, interviewed by American intelligence officers, described York as the finest soldier he had encountered, someone who fought with a skill and coolness that seemed almost superhuman. As word of York's actions spread through the 82nd Division and beyond, the military publicity machine began to recognize that it had a genuine hero, exactly the kind of story that could boost American morale and demonstrate to both allies and enemies that American soldiers could fight as effectively as any troops in the world. Within days, York was promoted to sergeant. Within weeks, he was being interviewed by war correspondents. General Pershing himself wanted to meet the Tennessee Sharpshooter who had captured more than 100 Germans single-handedly. The French government awarded York the Croix de Guerre. The American government awarded him the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, with a citation describing his extraordinary heroism and skill in action against the enemy. But York himself seemed uncomfortable with the attention and acclaim. He gave interviews because his officers ordered him to, but he deflected credit, insisting that the other men in the patrol deserved recognition, that God had guided his hand during the action, that he was just a soldier doing his duty. York finished out the war with the 82nd Division, participating in the final Allied offensives that drove the German army back toward the Rhine, experiencing the strange mixture of elation and exhaustion when the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. He returned to the United States in May 1919, landing in New York to discover that he had become a national celebrity, that newspapers had covered his story extensively, that crowds wanted to see the hero from Tennessee. New York City gave York a ticker tape parade. thousands of people lining the streets to cheer him. Politicians and businessmen wanted to meet him, to associate themselves with his success. Various commercial interests offered him money to endorse products, to appear in advertisements, to tell his story for profit. York found the whole experience bewildering and somewhat distasteful. He had grown up in a world where action spoke louder than words, where a man's worth was measured by his character and his deeds rather than his fame. The commercial exploitation of his military service struck him as wrong, as turning something sacred into something for sale. York returned to Tennessee, to Pall Mall and the Wolf River Valley, hoping to resume the quiet life he had left behind, but he couldn't escape what he had become. He was, whether he wanted it or not, a symbol of American courage, an example of how even the most unlikely hero, a backwoods pacifist who initially refused to fight, could rise to extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. York decided to use his fame for something worthwhile. He had seen during his time in the army how many American soldiers, particularly those from rural areas, lacked basic education. York himself had only completed the 3rd grade, and while he was naturally intelligent, he recognized how limited opportunities were for poor children in areas like Fentress County. He determined to establish a school that would provide education and vocational training for the mountain children of Tennessee. The Alvin C. York Agricultural Institute, later the Alvin C. York Institute, opened in Jamestown, Tennessee in 1926, funded initially by donations from across the country, with York contributing his own money and endless hours of fundraising and promotion. The school educated thousands of Tennessee students over the decades, providing opportunities that would have been impossible without York's determination to make his fame mean something beyond personal glorification. York married his longtime sweetheart Gracie Williams in 1919, raised a family on a farm near Pall Mall, and lived a life of relative simplicity despite his celebrity status. The Hollywood film Sergeant York, released in 1941 starring Gary Cooper, brought York's story to an even wider audience, earning Cooper an Academy Award and becoming one of the most successful films of its era. The movie, released as the United States was moving toward involvement in World War II, served as both entertainment and propaganda, showing American audiences what their soldiers could accomplish, inspiring a new generation to believe in American courage and capability. York insisted that all profits from the film go to supporting his educational institute and other charitable causes. He never sought to profit personally from his military service, maintaining that he had only done his duty and that profiting from killing even in wartime was fundamentally wrong. During World War II, York registered for the draft again despite being well over military age, stating that if his country needed him, he would serve again. He spent the war years touring military bases, speaking to troops, encouraging them, sharing lessons from his own experience. Younger soldiers, some of whom had grown up watching the film about York's exploits, met the real man and found him humble, soft-spoken, deeply religious, nothing like the Hollywood version of a warrior. York suffered strokes in the 1950s that left him partially paralyzed and eventually confined to bed. He died on September 2, 1964 in Nashville, Tennessee, and was buried in the Pall Mall Cemetery, returning to the mountains he had loved his entire life. The significance of Alvin York's action on October 8, 1918, extends far beyond the immediate tactical success of capturing German prisoners and silencing machine gun positions. York's story became part of American mythology, an example of how ordinary Americans, given extraordinary circumstances, can accomplish remarkable things. It reinforced American beliefs about individual initiative, about the value of rural skills and character, about the possibility of heroism in modern industrial warfare where individual actions seemed increasingly irrelevant compared to the mass destruction of artillery and machine guns. York proved that one person, acting with skill, courage, and determination, could still affect the outcome of battles even in the mechanized horror of World War I. York's action also highlighted the importance of marksmanship in combat, influencing American military training for decades. The US Army had historically emphasized rifle marksmanship, believing that American soldiers' individual shooting skills gave them an advantage over enemies who relied more on massed fire. York's success seems to validate this emphasis, showing that a truly skilled marksman could accomplish what entire platoons might not. This influenced military doctrine through World War II and beyond, with the Army continuing to invest heavily in marksmanship training, even as warfare became increasingly mechanized and dominated by automatic weapons. The psychological impact on German forces of York's action, and similar individual feats of American arms, contributed to the growing sense among German soldiers by late 1918 that the Americans, initially dismissed as inexperienced and likely ineffective, were actually formidable opponents who fought with a combination of skill, aggression, and innovative tactics. German intelligence reports from the period describe American soldiers as dangerous in close combat, excellent marksmen, and remarkably aggressive in attacking fortified positions. While American forces certainly had their share of failures and costly mistakes, actions like York's demonstrated that American soldiers could match or exceed their European counterparts when properly led and employed. For York personally, the action in the Argonne Forest represented both vindication and burden. It vindicated his decision to overcome his religious objections and serve, proving that he could be both a man of faith and a warrior when necessary. But it also burdened him with memories of killing that never fully left him, with the knowledge that his fame rested on his ability to kill other human beings efficiently and without hesitation. York rarely talked about the specific details of shooting German soldiers, generally deflecting such questions by saying he did what he had to do and that he prayed for forgiveness. He seemed to maintain his religious faith throughout his life, attending church regularly, reading his Bible, trying to reconcile the violence of October 8th with the teachings of Jesus Christ about loving one's enemies. The debate about the precise details of York's action continues among military historians. Some question whether York actually killed 25 Germans as officially credited, suggesting the number may have been inflated by the poor battlefield accounting or by York's own misremembering in the confusion of combat. Some suggest that other members of the patrol contributed more than they received credit for, that York's later fame overshadowed their contributions. German records from the period are incomplete, making it difficult to verify exact numbers, but what is indisputable is that York's patrol captured 132 German prisoners, that German machine gun positions that had been holding up the American advance were silenced, and that German and American witnesses agreed that York's actions were extraordinary, even by the standards of World War I, where extraordinary courage was commonplace. The comparison between York's action and similar feats by soldiers of other nations reveals both the universality and the distinctiveness of individual heroism in war. The German soldier Karl Saurer, fighting on the Russian front, captured over 200 Russian soldiers in a similar action involving surprise and skilled rifle fire. The Australian soldier Albert Jacka repeatedly attacked German positions single-handedly, capturing numerous prisoners and earning the Victoria Cross. The Canadian soldier Leo Clark silenced multiple German positions alone, capturing dozens of prisoners. What distinguishes York's action is not necessarily its uniqueness, but rather how it was documented, publicized, and incorporated into American national mythology. York became famous partly because American military authorities and the media recognized the value of his story at a time when the United States needed heroes to validate its participation in World War I. The tactical lessons from York's action influenced American small unit tactics for decades. His use of cover, his methodical engagement of targets starting with those farthest away, his quick transition from rifle to pistol when the situation changed, his use of the German officer as both shield and means of controlling prisoners, all demonstrated tactical flexibility and quick thinking that became teaching points in army infantry schools. The ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, to use psychological pressure as effectively as physical force to maintain control even when outnumbered 100 to 1, these were skills that could be taught and developed through training. The weapons York used that day, the M1917 Enfield rifle and the M1911 Colt pistol, became associated with his success in ways that influenced American small-arm development and procurement. The M1917, actually a modified British pattern, 1914 rifle chambered for American ammunition and produced under license in American factories, proved its effectiveness in York's hands. The rifle fired the powerful .30-06 cartridge, was accurate to 600 yards or more in skilled hands, and featured a smooth bolt action that allowed rapid fire. York's successful use of the weapon under combat conditions validated the Army's decision to adopt it alongside the Springfield M1903 as standard infantry rifles. The M1911 pistol, designed by John Browning and adopted by the Army in 1911, proved its worth during York's desperate defence against the German bayonet charge. The pistol's stopping power, firing a heavy .45 caliber bullet at relatively low velocity, dropped attacking Germans with single shots, and its reliability under stress confirmed the Army's faith in Browning's design. The M1911 would remain in American military service for over 70 years, used in World War II, Korea, Vietnam and beyond, partly because of its proven effectiveness in actions like York's. The specific techniques York used for prisoner control, particularly his use of the captured German officer as both interpreter and authority figure, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of military psychology. York recognized that German soldiers, trained to obey orders from their officers, would be more likely to surrender and remain compliant if their own officer commanded them to do so. By keeping Lieutenant Vollmer at the front of the prisoner column with a pistol pressed against his back, York ensured that the German officer had every incentive to convince other German positions to surrender peacefully. This technique, born from York's quick thinking under pressure, became a standard procedure taught to American soldiers for handling mass surrenders, recognized as more effective than trying to coerce prisoners through threats or violence. The effect of York's action on the morale of the 328th Infantry Regiment and the broader 82nd Division proved significant in the days following October 8th. Soldiers who had been pinned down by German machine gun fire, who had watched their friends die in futile attacks against fortified positions, suddenly had proof that German defences could be overcome by individual courage and skill. The regiment's subsequent attacks showed increased aggression and confidence, with soldiers more willing to take risks, more likely to press attacks even when facing strong resistance. Officers noted that mentioning York's action before an attack seemed to inspire soldiers, giving them the belief that extraordinary achievements were possible. Whether this actually made the regiment more effective is difficult to quantify, but the psychological value of having a genuine hero in their ranks cannot be dismissed. The German response to York's action reveals interesting aspects of German military culture and attitudes toward combat. German officers who interviewed captured members of York's patrol expressed grudging respect for York's marksmanship and tactical skill, but also anger at what they viewed as unfair tactics, particularly the use of Lieutenant Vollmer to force surrenders. Some German accounts describe York's shooting of the bayonet charge as dishonourable, arguing that once men have committed to a charge they should be met with equal courage rather than shot down with a pistol. These criticisms reflect different military cultures, with the German army emphasizing discipline, unit cohesion, and adherence to expected forms of combat, while American military culture emphasized individual initiative and pragmatism and winning by whatever means worked. York's willingness to use any advantage, to switch weapons when necessary, to exploit German command structures to control prisoners, represented a distinctly American approach to warfare that German officers found both effective and somehow unsporting. The long-term impact of York's action on his own life proved complex and not entirely positive. While he used his fame to accomplish genuine good through his educational work, he also struggled with the burden of being a living legend. People expected him to embody heroic virtues constantly, to be always brave, always wise, always an example. The reality of being a man with ordinary failings and doubts didn't match the public image, and York found himself trapped between who he actually was and who people needed him to be. Financial problems plagued him throughout his life despite his fame. The York Agricultural Institute consumed much of his money and required constant fundraising. Back taxes from income he received for the film about his life created debts he struggled to pay. Various business ventures failed. By the time of his death, York was not wealthy, having given away or spent most of what his fame had earned him. York's relationship with his fellow soldiers from the October 8th Patrol remained strong throughout his life. He maintained correspondence with survivors, attended reunions, and always insisted that they shared in whatever credit he received. When questioned about whether he deserved sole credit for the action, York would become visibly angry, stating that the other men fought just as bravely, that some died while he survived, and that luck and circumstance determined who received recognition. This modesty, whether genuine or cultivated, endeared York to those who knew him, contrasting with the bombastic self-promotion common among some military heroes. York seemed to understand that heroism in combat is rarely the product of one person acting alone, but rather the result of many people doing their duty, with recognition often falling to whoever happened to be in the right place at the right time to do something memorable. The theological implications of York's transformation from pacifist to warrior fascinated religious scholars and military chaplains for decades. York's case study became standard material in discussions about the Christian doctrine of just war, about the moral complexities of violence, about how people of genuine faith navigate situations that seem to demand actions contrary to their beliefs. Some religious pacifists criticized York for abandoning his principles, arguing that he should have maintained his conscientious objection regardless of consequences. Others held him up as an example of how faith must be balanced with practical necessities, how loving one's neighbour might sometimes require defending them from aggression. York himself never claimed to have resolved these tensions completely, stating in later interviews that he still struggled with whether his actions in the Argonne forest were truly justified, still prayed for the German soldiers he killed, still hoped that God would understand he had done what seemed right at the time. The commemoration of York's action took various forms over the decades following World War I. The state of Tennessee erected monuments, named buildings, and roads after him, and celebrated him as perhaps the state's most famous military hero. The federal government designated various memorials and sites associated with York's life. The French government maintained the site of his action in the Argonne forest, marking it as a place of historical significance. Successive generations of American soldiers studied York's action in military schools, analysing his tactics, debating his decisions, using his example to illustrate principles of small unit leadership and combat effectiveness. York became required study at West Point and other military academies, his action dissected in classroom discussions about initiative, marksmanship, and the importance of NCO leadership. The comparison of York's action to other Medal of Honor recipients from World War I provides useful context for understanding the nature of heroism in that conflict. The war produced 95 American Medal of Honor recipients, many for actions involving similar courage under fire, similar initiative in desperate circumstances, similar willingness to risk death to accomplish missions or save comrades. What distinguished York was not necessarily that his action was more heroic than others, but that it fit a narrative that American culture found particularly compelling. The backwoods marksman who became a warrior, the religious man who overcame his doubts to serve his country, the common soldier who through skill and courage accomplished what seemed impossible, these were themes that resonated with American self-conception and values. Other equally brave men received less attention because their stories didn't fit the narrative as perfectly. York's influence on American popular culture extended well beyond the 1941 film. Numerous books, both for adults and children, told his story. Comic books featured him as a character. His name appeared in songs, poems, and plays. Schools used his story to teach lessons about courage, duty, and overcoming internal conflicts. During World War II, recruiters used York's example to encourage enlistment, suggesting that ordinary Americans could become heroes if they served. During the Cold War, York represented American values in contrast to communist collectivism, the individual who through personal initiative and skill accomplished what bureaucratic systems could not. The mythologizing of York served various purposes across different eras, with each generation finding in his story whatever they needed to find, whether that was validation of American exceptionalism, proof of Christian virtue, or simply an inspiring tale of courage under fire. The medical and psychological aspects of York's action deserve consideration, because what he accomplished required not just skill, but also remarkable emotional control under extreme stress. Combat psychologists studying York's action note several factors that likely contributed to his ability to function so effectively. His religious faith, while initially a source of conflict, ultimately provided psychological grounding and a sense of purpose that sustained him through the trauma of killing. His hunting experience had conditioned him to remain calm while pursuing dangerous game, to control his fear response, to focus completely on the task at hand. His physical conditioning from years of mountain living gave him the stamina to keep fighting when others were exhausted. The adrenaline of combat, while debilitating for many soldiers, seemed to heighten York's senses and reaction time without causing the panic or freezing that afflicts some combatants. York was, in many ways, ideally suited by background and temperament for the specific challenge he faced on October 8th. The question of whether York's action could be replicated by other soldiers in similar circumstances has been debated extensively in military literature. Some argue that York's action was so unique, so dependent on his specific skills and the specific tactical situation, that it offers limited lessons for general military training. Others contend that the principles York demonstrated, quick thinking, marksmanship, tactical flexibility, and psychological understanding of the enemy, are learnable skills that can be developed through proper training. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. While most soldiers would not accomplish what York did even in similar circumstances, training that emphasizes initiative, marksmanship, and adaptability can increase the probability that some soldiers will rise to extraordinary performance when circumstances demand it. The international reaction to York's fame reveals interesting cultural differences in how nations celebrate military heroism. British and Commonwealth forces, while respecting York's achievement, were somewhat bemused by the extensive American publicity surrounding a single action that, while impressive, was not vastly different from numerous acts of individual heroism throughout the war. French soldiers, veterans of 4 years of grinding trench warfare, saw York's action as admirable but hardly unique, given the countless similar acts of courage by French, British, German, and other soldiers. The American enthusiasm for York's story reflected both the nation's relative inexperience with large-scale modern warfare and its cultural tendency toward individualism and the celebration of personal achievement. Where European military cultures emphasized collective sacrifice and unit cohesion, American culture sought individual heroes whose stories could be told, understood, and celebrated. York's later life included one final service to his country during the Korean War era, when he spoke out against communist aggression and encouraged American resolve during the early difficult days of that conflict. Though elderly and in declining health, York made himself available for interviews, radio broadcasts, and public appearances where he urged Americans to remember the lessons of both world wars, that freedom required defending, that evil needed to be opposed with force when necessary, that individual courage still mattered even in an age of atomic weapons and massive armies. His message resonated with Americans who had lived through World War II and now faced another challenge to democratic values, though York himself expressed sadness that the world had not learned the lessons he hoped it would from the terrible cost of the 2 world wars. The preservation of York's legacy continues through various institutions and memorials. The Sergeant York Patriotic Foundation works to keep his memory alive and to support causes he cared about, particularly education and veterans services. The Alvin York Institute continues to educate students in Tennessee. Museums in Tennessee and at military installations preserve artifacts associated with York's life and service. The battlefield site in France where York earned the Medal of Honor is maintained as a memorial where visitors can walk the ground and try to imagine what happened there on that October morning over a century ago. These efforts ensure that future generations will know York's story, though whether they will understand its full complexity, the tension between faith and duty, the cost of violence even in a just cause, the difference between the myth and the man, remains uncertain. In the final analysis, Alvin York represents something fundamental about the American experience in war, the transformation of ordinary citizens into warriors when circumstances demand it, the tension between American values of peace and the necessities of defending those values through violence, and the possibility that individual courage and skill can still matter in modern warfare's industrial horror. York was not a professional soldier seeking glory, not a militarist eager for combat, but a reluctant warrior who fought because he believed it was right, who killed because he saw no alternative, and who spent the rest of his life trying to make meaning from those few minutes of violence that defined him forever. His story endures because it speaks to these universal human questions about duty, sacrifice, courage, and the terrible burden of having to kill in defense of what one loves. The man who captured 132 Germans alone was also the man who prayed for their souls, who wished the war had never happened, and who dedicated his remaining years to building rather than destroying. That complexity, more than the simple narrative of heroism, is what makes Alvin York's story worth remembering and worth telling to each new generation that must wrestle with the same questions he faced in the forests of France over a century ago.